Galysh, and in this lesson video I'm going to talk about some of the general ideas I think of when I'm playing over dominant seventh chords. In this lesson we're going to talk about the pentatonic scale and the blues scale. We'll keep it kind of simple and keep it framed within maybe some scales that you already know, those two scales. When I'm soloing, I tend to conceptually think about consonance versus dissonance. Much like a EQ knob on an amplifier, I kind of think the zero mark or the far left might be matching up a scale that is most consonant with the chord that I'm playing, where the notes match up specifically to be correct. And then, to make things interesting in my solos, I like to think that I can introduce notes that don't line up with the chord tones. And I can introduce one note at a time, a few notes at a time, a lot of notes at a time, and that will take me further outside or further dissonance compared to what I'm playing over. Let me start with my first example. So if we're playing an A dominant seventh chord, that's a A major chord with a minor seventh in it. So I mostly think of this chord as a major chord. And the major pentatonic scale, which is A, B, C sharp, E, F sharp, and A, works great over this chord. It contains the major triad chord tones. It doesn't have the minor seventh in it, but since it doesn't play anything that's too, far outside of that note, it's almost as if we don't mind that it isn't there. So this scale, the major pentatonic, works perfectly and consonantly over an A dominant seventh chord. If I wanted to make things a little more interesting, I might consider adding the minor third to make what we call the the major blues scale, adding a C note to that previous scale. So I have my major chord tones again, but I have sort of this minor third sound that clashes with the major third in the chord. If we use it as a passing tone, this won't matter too much because we'll quickly get through that note and you won't hear the dissonance so much. But if you're wanting to make your solos interesting, you might want to let that note linger, and that contrast, that dissonance, yields even more of a resolution when you finally get to your next note. So that's a good place to start. While we're there and we have this minor third, I generally think of my next most dissonant scale would be the minor pentatonic scale. A lot of people use this already just out of habit, and it's the first scale you might learn. And we've heard Jimmy Page and Hendrix use the same thing, the A minor pentatonic scale over dominant seventh chords or over the blues. Now that minor third clashes with the major third in the chord, and we tend to bend it to make it work, and that's how we sort of get that bluesy sound, that bending sound. So this makes things even more spicy, a little bit more dissonant. We're now using notes that clash with specific chord tones. Next on my roster of things I might use to improvise would be my minor blues scale. So it's just like the minor pentatonic, but we introduce this passing tone between D and E. It's a flatted fifth or a sharp fourth. It's a tritone. That note right there. There it is again. This note is really dissonant. It is not found in our dominant seventh chord and really sticks out. If you play it as a passing tone, you may not even know that it's there, but if you focus on it, it really adds a lot of contrast that resolves really quickly as you continue on with your phrases. So far to recap, we've got our major pentatonic scale, sounds just right. Perhaps a little vanilla, but it works. The major blues scale adds a little bit of contrast and interest with that new minor third note along with the major third. The minor pentatonic always sounds like rock and roll. Very interesting. I like to bend those minor thirds up to the major thirds, but sometimes I don't. And then we have our minor blues scale. And that adds its own contrast with a very dissonant note, relative, and makes things even spicier. If you've seen my other video, The Scale That Will Change Your Life, I talk about the idea of flattening the root of a minor pentatonic scale to get a very outside sound. So if you take your minor pentatonic that everybody knows and loves, and you flatten the root, so your A is now A flat, A flat, A flat, you get a very outside sound that eventually really wants to resolve back to that regular A note. And that sounds pretty outside. I would think if there's a chord tone that you don't mess with, it's probably the root, but here we do specifically that. Not only do we have a minor third instead of a major third, we've taken the actual foundation of the chord, the root, and we flattened it. So we get a very outside sound there. A lot of other people know of the side step trick for getting another sort of fusiony outside sound. And that's like taking whatever scale, whether it be the major pentatonic or minor pentatonic or blues scales or your diatonic scales, and simply moving up a half step briefly, and just taking that whole scale up a half step and then come back down. So it really bends the ears, makes things very interesting, but completely starts changing a whole lot of notes automatically. And takes you way outside of the comfort zone of those chord tones that we're playing over. So, in my mind, I think of major pentatonic, consonant, major blues scale, a little interesting with the minor third. Minor pentatonic gets a little bit more dissonant, introduces that minor third, but it does have the minor seventh. Then I think of the minor blues scale. Not only do we have the minor seventh and the minor third, but we also now have the tritone, which isn't found in the chord at all. And that sounds pretty darn outside. And then I think of the minor pentatonic scale with a flatted root. That sounds very ear-bending, very dissonant. And then last but not least, this side step where we take the minor pentatonic scale and simply move it up a whole, a half step. These are basic ideas. We haven't even talked about diatonic scales, playing Mixolydian over these things, but wanted to kind of keep it at a level that maybe somebody who just knows a couple pentatonic scales and their blues scale can relate to, possibly add a couple new ideas and scales to it, and now you have a way of going from completely consonant playing to pretty darn dissonant playing, and you can mix it up. Again, I think of it like a knob where I can turn the dissonance up depending on the scale I start to use. After a while, your ears start to recognize not necessarily the sound of the scales, but the different notes that you are introducing to the mix that are not chord tones or not jiving with the chord tones. I'm going to show you in this diagram next how these scales compare and contrast to each other as they look on the fretboard. There's a lot of guitarists, musicians, a lot of jazz musicians who don't think of scales. And after a while, you won't. You will simply hear the sounds of these combinations of notes for what they are, consonant or dissonant. And I've been often told that any of the 12 notes in an octave will work when you improvise. It really depends on how you use them. In this next diagram I'm going to show you how they all kind of work together. What you'll see is the major pentatonic. I'm going to now add the blues note for the major blues scale. I'm going to keep those notes, and now I'm going to add the notes of the minor pentatonic, and now I'm going to add the notes of the minor blues scale. Now I'm going to include that flatted root that we just talked about. In addition to that, the minor pentatonic, but up a half step. And now you should see all 12 notes in an octave. I hope you enjoyed this. Have a good one, and keep practicing.